All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Will Hickox of the Watkins Museum of History, and welcome to Portals to the Past. Portals to the Past is a series of interviews with historical figures of the Kansas-Missouri border region. This series is a partnership between the Watkins Museum of History, Humanities Kansas, and Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. Today, through a miracle of time travel, we are honored to speak with Octave Chanute, the famed civil engineer who constructed stockyards and railroads and other projects across the United States. So we're very excited to bring Mr. Chanute to our screens this evening. We encourage you, the audience members, to get involved by posting questions for our guest in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I'd like to say hello to Mr. Chanute and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Will. It's wonderful to join you and be with you. You mentioned Lenexa, Kansas. That's where I'm broadcasting from. I'm in Lenexa today, and I know you're in Lawrence. Lenexa is a suburb of Kansas City, and so we're only about 20 miles away from each other. And you know, that town in southeast Kansas named for me, Chanute, Kansas. I'm about 110 miles north of Chanute. So it's very good to be sandwiched in between those two fine cities and come with you and speak to you and your audience tonight. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, as I said, we're honored to have you. And we're just glad that you had time to take yourself away from your busy working life to speak with us here tonight.
You bet.
So first of all, I wonder if you could start us off by giving us some of the story of your early life. Where were you born and how did you arrive in this area?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Will. I was born in Paris. In fact, there's a traffic feature there in the boulevard system in Paris named for me. And I came to the United States at age 6 with my father. I came across the Atlantic with my father. I was born in 1832. Came when I was 6, crossed the Atlantic with my father. He was coming to be a professor at a college down in Louisiana. My mother and my siblings did not come with us. My folks did not have a good marriage. They stayed in Paris. My father and I stayed in Louisiana till I was about 14. We had moved from the college then to New Orleans, but when I was about 14, my father moved the two of us up to New York. He was going to write books. And really, it was that trip up to New York that sparked my interest in transportation. We took all kinds of modes of transportation, of course, trains, steamboats, cog railroads, canals. We went through some locks, and it really intrigued me, all the different technology and all the systems of transportation to get to New York. When I was 17, I thought I'd try to put that interest to work. And I went to the Hudson River Railroad trying to find a job, asked them if they had any openings. They did not, but I always had a lot of confidence. And I told them that I worked for free. I probably thought that they'd soon recognize my genius and hire me. And sure enough, 3 months later, they hired me at $1.12 a day to work there on the Hudson River Railroad. And they put me on their surveys crew, pulling chain. And I'll tell you, Will, I never had to apply for another job the rest of my life. I kept getting promoted or recruited away to other positions. So that's my early life and how I came to be involved with transportation, which really involved my whole adult life and professional career.
Well, that's fascinating, and boy, $1.12 a day, that was quite a princely sum, I suppose. I'm being sarcastic, of course. Uh, so this is another interesting fact that I heard about your early life, and of course, I mean no disrespect when I ask this question. It just strikes me as something that our audience will find very interesting. Is it true that you have no formal engineering degree? And if so, how did you learn your craft and become so skilled as an engineer?
Yes, that's correct, Will. Don't have a degree. In those days, you learned at the elbow of other people, for instance, that surveyor's crew and if I can put in air quotes, the chief engineer of the railroads. You would learn following their example and asking questions and have them teach you. In fact, after I had become established, I was appointed by the American Society of Civil Engineers to come up with some kind of credentialing for engineers who did not have schooling, but they wanted something that would tell the whole United States, the whole world, that yes, these people were trained engineers. They had learned from the best. And it was a combination of, if I remember correctly, it was like 7 years experience or a combination of schooling and 5 years experience is what we came up with, so that there would be a system of credentials that everybody would recognize. And of course, when you felt that you could teach someone else the skills that went along with engineering, then you could put CE, civil engineer, behind your name. Thank you for that, Will.
Of course, yes. Well, that's very interesting. So you're not only a pioneer in developing Kansas City, but you're a pioneer of the whole credentialing process for civil engineers. That's amazing.
Yes, sir.
So, of course, you alluded to this earlier. How did Chanute, Kansas come to be named for you?
Well, there was a great railroad race in the early 1870s. That's after I had built the Hannibal Bridge in Kansas City, and as mentioned, laid out the original town of Lenexa. I did that in 1869. But there was a great railroad race, and it was between the LL&G, the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad. I was the track boss of the LL&G. And the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad, which everybody knows as the MKT. And then that MKT was shortened to KT, and then it was slurred into Katy. So everybody knows the Katy Railroad. That's how it gets its name. Well, the race was south through Kansas. And whoever could get to the Oklahoma border, it was Indian Territory then, but whoever could get to Oklahoma, Indian Territory, whichever railroad got there first, would get free land down to Texas to ship cattle on the railroad back east to the population back east. Well, as we went through Neosho County, which is 2 counties up from Oklahoma, the MKT was ahead. The Katy Railroad was ahead. And you could tell the way I was laying my track that those 2 rail lines were going to intersect. And wherever the railroads intersected, that was going to be a place, a booming place, many people thought. And so land speculators, before I got there to the Katy rail line, land speculators went out and platted 4 little towns, hoping I'd come through their town. New Chicago, Chicago Junction, Tioga, Alliance, 4 little towns. Well, I went through and missed all 4 of them. And so for 3 years, those 4 towns vied for supremacy in the area. And 2 of them, Tioga and I believe Alliance, 2 of them came to me in 72. By that time, I was the superintendent of the LL&Gs. Later, it was absorbed into the Santa Fe lines. but they came to me and asked that I would build a depot in between their two towns. And I said, I'll build a depot if you all band together and quit dividing your efforts, band together and we'd all prosper. Well, that's what they did. They built, they all banded together and named the town, when they banded together, named it Chanute. Now, some people think, I'll give you two schools of thought. Some people think that because of that idea, hey, band together and we'll all prosper, that it was a thank you to me to name the town for me. Others think that perhaps if the town put my name on the town and on the depot, and since I was superintendent of line, maybe I would ship more freight on the line. Maybe more passengers would come through. Maybe prosperity would get there sooner. There's a lot of towns that are named for railroad executives. You know, be a bit cynical to try to curry favor with the railroad by naming their name, you know, Holiday, Parsons, Newton. Those are all railroad executive names. And so that's how Chanute came to be, and how they honor me by naming their town for me. Now, if you bear with me, Will, let me tell you how that railroad race ended. Okay, we came through Neosho County, and then I pulled ahead, and I thought I had won the race. I thought I had got to Indian Territory, Oklahoma, and I started laying off my crews. Well, the Katy Railroad, they came along behind me, hired my crews, and laid track farther south. I had gone to the wrong surveyor's mark, so I didn't go far enough south. So the Katy Railroad actually won the race. But there's a great Supreme Court case that says you cannot give away what you don't own. So that was Indian Territory. Federal government could not give the free land for the railroad to go on down to Texas to get the cattle. And so you had to negotiate with the tribes to cross Indian Territory. So that's how Chanute came to be named for me, and that's how the railroad race ended up.
Well, it's a more interesting and complicated tale than I expected. So thank you for that. Wow. So we'll turn our gaze north a little bit here. So for many years, the Missouri River stood as a powerful obstacle to the development of this region of the greater Kansas City area as it became. So could you tell the story of the first railroad bridge and your involvement in it and how it transformed Kansas City?
Oh, well, I'd love to. Yes, the Missouri River, it's a fast river. It's a treacherous river. It's fast. You take a glass of water, dip it into the river and put it up on a shelf, and 20 minutes later, you've got a quarter inch, half inch of silt. So it's constantly churning up the riverbed, and it's fast and dangerous. And people thought it was impossible to bridge that treacherous Missouri River. Well, Kansas City brought me down from Chicago to see if I couldn't tame the river, so to speak, build a bridge. I had a very good reputation as a bridge builder, not only a bridge builder, but a railroader. And I had built the world's largest drawbridge at the time over the Illinois River at Peoria. That's where I met my wife, Annie. I plan to be buried there someday in Peoria. But so I had a good reputation as a bridge builder. Kansas City brought me down. St. Joe, Missouri, Leavenworth, Kansas were much bigger cities. They also wanted the bridge across the Missouri River because whoever crossed the river, that was going to be the big city in the Missouri Valley. Kansas City got permission from Congress to bridge the Missouri. I came in '67. It took me almost 3 years to build that bridge. It beat me twice. Ice comes down the river during the winter, knocks out my piers, It's a horrific river. I got a photograph of July 3rd, 1869, the day we cut the ribbon on the river, on the bridge. By building the bridge, the trains were able to cross that river in 2 minutes. If you were on foot, it took you 5 minutes, or in a wagon. Up to that time, there were 4 railroads that came in on the south side, 3 on the north side. Up to that time, you had to stop the train, unload it, ferry it across the river, reload it. How slow was that? How heavy was that? How many times did you drop something on your toe? I mean, it was just a big impediment. And by building the bridge, that made Kansas City the big city in the Missouri Valley. Now it's a drawbridge, but not a drawbridge like you might think that goes up like this. It's a drawbridge that pivots. It pivots on this second pier. And the way we built those piers, oh my heavens, there was 60 feet of water and mud and silt before you got to bedrock. And we would pound metal rods through that water, mud, silt, down to bedrock, 4 of them. Then we put caissons attached to those, and we would lower those down through the water, and divers would go down. We put divers under the water with the big oxygen apparatus, and they would water jet a little trench around the caisson. And then we would put rock and straw and a tarp, and then more rock, more straw, more tarp, until it was really secure. And then we would pump the water and the mud and the rocks and the boulders out of that, what in effect was a dam, and we could build the piers inside that dam. And we just kept lowering, the caissons were about 18 feet high each one, and we just kept lowering them down as the piers, but as deep as we need to go. The pivot, the second pier pivot, the river always had the right of way. The river always had the right of way. A guard up on the bridge would stop the train, open the track, the barge or the boat would go by, and then they'd close it up again and the train could continue on. Now, I told you earlier that St. Joe, Leavenworth, they wanted the bridge, but geography argues for putting the bridge where we put it. If you're familiar with Kansas City today, here's the Hannibal Bridge. It's the Kansas City Bridge. We all call it the Hannibal Bridge because it's the Hannibal St. Joseph Railroad that put most of the money in. It is just east of the Broadway Bridge today, Buck O'Neill Bridge. All right, by building it there, you are south of the Missouri River and also the Kansas River. If you would have built the bridge up at Leavenworth or at St. Joe, you would have had to build another bridge to cross the Call, the Kansas River. So geography argued for putting it at Kansas City in that location. Now, I mentioned the Broadway or the Buck O'Neill Bridge. My bridge lasted till 1917. And then there'd been a tornado, there'd been a couple of floods, a few barges had hit it, and there were better techniques, better materials. So Kansas City rebuilt the Hannibal Bridge, and they put a level for automobiles on it at that time. And then in 1954, when the Broadway, Buck O'Neill Bridge came in, for automobiles, they took that level off. And you can still see the Hannibal Bridge, second one, it's on the same alignment, almost the same alignment. It goes a little bit farther east on the north side, but the south side, just the same spot that we chose. So, and that made Kansas City the big city. That's why the Kansas City Stockyards located in Kansas City, because all the trains came in, 4 on the south side, 3 on the north side, and just a wonderful connection. It made Kansas City the big city. You go back and read a Harper's Weekly magazine article in the early 1860s, and it calls Kansas City a town near Leavenworth, Kansas. That bridge flipped the equation. Now Leavenworth is near Kansas City. So thank you, Will. That's the Hannibal Bridge.
Well, thank you for that amazing description of this engineering marvel that you built. So it's hard to imagine anything being more interesting than the bridge project that you just described, but I know that you also had a hand in the Chicago and the Kansas City Stockyards. And from what you just told me, the Stockyards are very much connected to the railroads. So could you tell us more about your work with the Stockyards?
Absolutely. And you mentioned that the story of the bridge was interesting, Will, and it caused me to think that I got an awful lot of help from people that came before me. I exchanged letters with bridge builders in Germany over the Rhine River while I was building the Hannibal Kansas City Bridge. I also talked with the American Indians in the area of Kansas City, asked the question, how high does the water get around here? Well, they showed me the water line from that horrific 1844 flood. They showed me that water line. So I built my bridge 10 feet higher than that 1844 flood. Now the Stockyards, both the Stockyards in Chicago and in Kansas City, I designed them both. The Chicago Stockyards, I designed them first, but really designed them for the same reason. There was just mass confusion with cattle. In Chicago especially, 4 what I'll call stockyards had materialized, moving all the cattle to Chicago so they could feed the population back east. And just imagine trading livestock and taking the surface roads of Chicago, herding cattle down those roads. They're already crowded with people. And so Chicago wanted to consolidate into a stockyard. Plus they were dumping the manure and all into the river, and it's the same source of drinking water for the population. And so since nobody had ever designed a large stockyard, the leaders of Chicago asked the chief engineers of the 9 railroads that serve Chicago to come up with ideas and a plan and submit plans and ideas. And I won the competition for the plan. I was chief engineer for the Chicago and Altoon Railroad at that time. Now, what have I won? Well, they wanted me to build it in 300 acres of swamp along the river. And so the first thing we had to do was drain the swamp. And so I arranged for 30 miles of pipe to drain the swamp, and then had to build a dam to keep it dry, and had to arrange the manure to be piped out, and then once again into the river, but downstream from where the population took the water in for their own consumption. So and really it was just the mass confusion that caused the city of Chicago to need the stockyard. Same way with Kansas City, all the railroads came in and they needed some organization for all the cattle that were coming in. And I designed so that each railroad had 500 feet of dock in order to offload cattle and weigh them and take them to market. So it was the Kansas City Stockyard started in 1871. Chicago started right after the Civil War. In fact, we probably started 65, 64, just as the Civil War was wrapping up. all the cattle went to Chicago because not only supplying the military, but like I said, the population back east. So very proud of that involvement with the Stockyards, both Chicago and Kansas City.
Well, on the subject of the Stockyards, Dorothy has a question for us. Was Chicago's stockyard the first in the United States?
Well, there was a lot of cattle, Chicago, Cincinnati, Louisville, but to consolidate like we did in Chicago, I like to think it was the first. Yes, but I'm not a humble man, Will. Yes, to consolidate that into the large stockyard there in Chicago. Yes.
Excellent. Well, I know that we have some other questions here, and this is going, oh, okay. So this is going to take us back in time to your early career. So Roxanne, if I apologize for forcing you to switch gears back to your days on the Hudson River, but Roxanne would like to know, what is pulling chain? You described earlier that you pulled chain.
Yes, that's how we measured. That's how we measured everything. You knew how long the chain was and how long each link was. Pardon me, that's a wonderful question. And that's why, even when you buy land today, you may think that you're buying a mile by a mile. Well, when the surveyors get out there today with their with all their technical tools and better surveying instruments, because you're going up and down hills with the chains, you may be short that mile a few feet. You may be long a few feet, but that's exactly what it was. It was our measuring device by that you could, and it was flexible. It was just chain links, and you could stretch them pretty tight, because a lot of times you're going through the woods and forest and across hills and across creeks, and so that's why it wasn't as accurate as our instruments today. But I'll tell you what, it got the job done.
Excellent.
Very good question. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a good question. So going forward again to the story of your bridge construction in Kansas City on the Missouri River, Anna noticed that you said you questioned the American Indians about how high the water rose on the river. Do you know which nation or tribe that was? Would it have been like the Kaw or Kansa Nation?
I really don't know. I know that the Delaware, by that time, the Delaware had sold some of the Delaware had been removed from Ohio after being removed from the Delaware area. And they were, their reservation was right at the conjunction of the Kansas and the Missouri River, very fertile soil. And they had sold some. So they were here in 44, so they would have known, and they had sold some of their reservation to the Wyandots who had come from Missouri. Of course, the Shawnee were here, but that was in the south side of the Kansas River, the Delaware, Wyandotte on the north side. And of course, the Kansa or the Kaw and the Muncie, there were various tribes in the area, but for me to pinpoint one, I don't remember if I ever knew.
Mm-hmm. So Dorothy would like to know, she noticed that you mentioned making a pivot bridge, and what is a pivot bridge, and was that your idea? Well,
no, not my idea, but it pivots on one of the piers, and it took 4 men and levers to rotate it, and you could do it with 1 man if you had a steam engine helping him. But you can see you can see that when it opens, it would sit on two other piers while the boats and the barges went by. And also we would, so that there wouldn't be any accidents, we would gang floating docks up the river so that the boats and barges had a bigger target to slide in and pass the bridge and the piers, and then it would close. And the new Hannibal, which was built in 1917 to replace my Hannibal, it pivots also. And if you're lucky enough to be down by the river when it's opening, it's quite a spectacle. And you know, trains cross it every day. Kansas City still has a lot of train traffic. You're welcome.
Yeah. Well, I know that you are very proud of your work in Chicago and Kansas City, and of course, we're very interested in your development in this region. But I would like to move on because you've been active in other areas as well. So how did you help improve public transportation in New York City?
Thank you, Will. You know, the American Society of Civil Engineers, they asked me to chair two committees. One, the rapid transit in New York City, and also wood preservation for the railroad. But the rapid transportation question in New York City, New York's always been crowded. And city leaders asked the American Society of Civil Engineers to study the problem. The committee that I chaired came up with the elevated lines. We looked at subways, we looked at elevated lines, recommended the elevated lines, and that's what the people of New York, that the leaders accepted that recommendation, and then the people of New York funded it to build the elevated lines. 20 years later, I'm still involved with the American Society of Civil Engineers and New York City on their question of mass transportation and rapid transportation. Another committee took up the question again, and this committee recommended the subway system. And so I was involved with New York for a couple of decades in trying to help them with their transportation questions. You know, the first committee also recommended that you locate warehouses near the depots of those elevated trains so that commerce and goods could more easily be moved and distributed. Now, the other committee that the American Society of Civil Engineers asked me to chair was on wood preservation. And that was an important committee because a lot of as the railroads went west, you run out of trees. And so there wasn't the ready railroad ties right there as you're building. And so to come up with a process for wood preservation was important. Europe had used the creosote method for years, but it was too expensive, we thought, here in America. We came up with the Burtonizing idea, and it extended the life of railroad ties from 7 years to 14 years. Now, some people credit me with inventing the date nail. I did not invent it. I brought that idea from Europe. I would go back to Europe often to visit family and share ideas with transportation. And the date nail is just exactly what it sounds, a small spike with a date embedded in the top, so that when you pound it into the railroad tie, or even up through the 1960s, pound it into a telephone pole, you could walk by that wood and see, oh, that was laid in 1890. And if it's, 1904, well, then it's time to start doing maintenance. And besides extending the life of the tie, that made it so that the trains could travel at the speed they were designed to travel at, because now the ties weren't weak and the rails were unsteady. They were solid. And so you could operate the train to its assigned weight, to its assigned speed, and all of that flows to the bottom line and efficiencies for the railroads. And I got fairly wealthy after that committee. I I went into the tie preservation company. My friend Joseph Carter and I started a tie preservation company there in Chicago, and we sold railroad ties to the railroad and got fairly wealthy. Joseph went and died on me, so I had to scramble to get good help and good partners. But that left me, that income gave me the time to study flight eventually. My wife Annie didn't want this avocation of flight. I'd always had an interest in it to get in the way of my real job of engineering. We had 6 children and we had to get them educated and all. So I remember very dramatically, I wrote in my diary that I took my ideas on flight and aerial navigation and tied a red ribbon around them and set them aside so that I could concentrate on engineering. But I'm getting ahead of myself, Will. Those were the 2 committees that I chaired for the American Society of Civil Engineers.
Excellent, excellent. Well, you did mention your work in the aviation field, and we have one final question for you today, but it's a good one. We got a question emailed to us by Scotty, and Scotty wanted to know, Mr. Chanute, about your work in aviation pioneering, and what was your relationship with the Wright brothers? Because he heard that you had a falling out with them eventually. So could you tell us more about your work in aviation and your relationship with the Wrights?
Absolutely, Will. I had always worried and studied how wind affected my bridges, especially through canyons and over rivers. And so I was always interested in airflow. That got me interested in flight and aerial navigation. Not many people with a good reputation of civil engineering or engineering period or being a scientist wanted to study the question because many people thought it was a fool's errand, this flight business. And so I was one of the few who had not only a good reputation with civil engineering, but also an interest in flight. And so whenever I would read about something that had to do with flight anywhere in the world, I had 2 newspaper clipping services that would send me information. And I would write letters to people, Germany, France, South America, what's going on in your part of the world with flight? And, oh, we tried this. Oh, they tried that last year. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? So I became, because of my good reputation as bridge builder, engineer, railroader, I became really I gathered all the information. People would write back to me because of that reputation. And I would offer my advice, and then I would pass it out to other people. And in fact, I wrote 27 magazine articles with that information. And then in 1890, I published them in railroad journals. And then I published them in a book in 1894 called Progress in Flying Machines. And the Smithsonian, after Wilbur Wright had written to the Smithsonian asking for advice, Smithsonian wrote back and said, hey, here's all our pamphlets. If you're serious about this, find Chanute in Chicago. Read his book and he'll help you. Wilbur wrote to me in 1900, dear Mr. Chanute, my brother and I have some ideas on flight. We fear if we don't get some help, we will lose our fortune or our lives. Will you help us? Well, I've been getting help my whole life. Those bridge builders in Germany, those American Indians in Kansas City, I've been getting help my whole, so sure, I'm going to help you. I became their mentor. I was at Kitty Hawk in 01, 02, and 03. I wasn't there when they flew. I wasn't there when they flew on December 17th, 1903, because, they had never been there that long. They'd always come after the bicycle season and only stayed a few months, but they were so close in 1903 to actually putting a power source on it and flying. But by that time, I was 71 years old, and the weather right out on the ocean, the wind, I left. But we did have a falling out. we did have a falling out. You know, I had spent decades collecting information and passing it out. The Wrights, when they uncovered all those secrets, here I am still talking about what they're doing. And they wanted to close down really because they thought they could sell it to the War Departments, the United States, France, Germany. You know, they thought they were about that far ahead of the rest of the world. They were light years ahead of the rest of the world. And so we did have a falling out, misunderstanding. We did reconcile. In fact, Wilbur wrote me the letter and said, you know, my brother and I don't make friends easily, and we'd hate to lose a friendship over a misunderstanding. And so we did reconcile, but that's a good question. And, you know, Catherine, their sister, the night that Orville and Wilbur flew, their sister Catherine, who I think is the third Wright brother, she telegraphed me that they had been successful on December 17th, 1903. They were ready to quit in 1901 because nothing was working. And Catherine would not let them quit. She dressed Wilbur up in Orville's good clothes, pushed him out the door, and I arranged for him to speak at an American Society of Civil Engineers conference, and it re-energized them. And they went back and did their own wind tunnel experiments. And I'm just proud of those boys and just proud that I had something to do with helping get them off the ground.
That's amazing. And, you know, it really sounds like you deserve more recognition, but it's good to know that you're just proud of them for their achievements.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You know, there's an Air Force base named for me in Rantoul, Illinois. It was decommissioned in the 80s. And, you know, I'm in a few national scientific halls of fame around the world. So I get enough credit. I'm also depicted in the United States Capitol Rotunda. Next time you're in Washington, go to the Rotunda. The paintings depicting American history from Columbus around to the Wright brothers. I'm in the section with the Wright brothers and Da Vinci and Langley and Orville and Wilbur. So I get plenty of thanks.
Well, you're in good company there, certainly.
Oh, fast company. Whoo!
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we all feel that we were in good company tonight listening to your achievements. So, Mr. Chanute, I'd just like to thank you very much for taking, as I said earlier, some time out of your busy life to speak with us about everything that you've accomplished. So just thank you very much.
You're welcome, Will. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Of course. So now I'd like to move into part 2 of this program, in which we chat with the man who brought Octave Chanute alive for us today. His name is Bill Nixon. Earlier this year, he did a great presentation. It may have been, actually, I believe it was last year, about in which he brought James Naismith, inventor of basketball, alive for us. And he's brought an inventor of a different sort, or certainly an engineer, alive for us tonight. So hello, Bill, and thanks for joining us.
Hello, Will. I took the whiskers off. As you can see, I have trouble keeping hair on any part of my head, you know, so yeah, thank you. It's always a joy to bring Octave Chanute to people. He's an amazing man.
He really is, yeah. So Bill, I wonder how, speaking on that subject, could you tell us how you learned of Octave Chanute and how you researched his life in order to craft this great portrayal that you've brought us tonight?
I tell you, I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I live and I worked in the city of Lenexa. Mm-hmm. And when I discovered, now there's an arrogant term, I discovered Octave Chanute. When I discovered that he laid out the original town of Lenexa, 42 acres large, same summer he built the Hannibal Bridge, which made Kansas City the dominant city. Chanute, Kansas, named for him, and he helped the Wright brothers get off the ground. When I discovered that, and I thought to myself, I didn't know any of that. And if old Bill didn't know any of that, no one knows any of that. So I started doing overhead projector slide shows of Octave Chanute. I asked our Lenexa Historical Society if I could do one, and other people, word of mouth, you know how those service clubs are, word of mouth. I was busy. And my Aunt Mary saw me do it one time. She said, Billy, you should do him as a first person. You know that material so well. You got the same hairdo. You should do him as a first person. And so I did, fell in love with doing it that way. He introduced me to Wilbur Wright, and I do Wilbur Wright as a first person. And then my third character was James Naismith that you mentioned earlier. And I've got two others, Ike Eisenhower and Tom Pendergast, the Kansas City boss from the 20s and 30s. I do Pendergast as a warning. My other four characters are inspirational. I do Pendergast as a warning to pay attention to what kind of leaders you have in your town. So I just fell into it, frankly, and just love doing it and love developing a new character about every 5 years. And, you know, I got to meet Chanute's biographer, Simmon Short. She's a real historian up in Chicago at the Soaring Museum. And I got to know her when she was writing her book on Chanute, the biography. And so you just read everything you can and pick out what you think are the interesting parts, and other people think it's interesting also. So I'm just a lucky guy, Will.
Well, you're certainly right there. Speaking as a fellow historian, you just read everything you can, and there's no better method for learning about a subject, certainly. So just one final question, Bill. Do you belong to any historical or storytelling societies that we should know about?
Well, I don't belong to any storytelling, but I belong to the Native Sons and Daughters of Kansas City, of course, Lenexa, the Historic Trails of Kansas City, Grinter House, Monticello, of course, Kansas State Historical. Those are all very good groups, very good groups. You learn a lot being around other people. They may not have the same interest you have in the Wright brothers or Octave Chanute, but they know about American Indians, or they know about railroads. They know about the river, you know, and but just like Chanute was a lifelong learner, you pick and choose it. You know what? Chanute brought a technique from bridge building to stabilization of the airplane, the biplane configuration. He brought Pratt trusses to stabilize that, and he used Pratt trusses in stabilizing his bridges. And so learn whatever you can as long as you can. You never can tell when you're going to bring a technique from the bridge building, put it with a glider, and pretty soon the Wright brothers are flying and Neil Armstrong's on the moon. I mean, just learn everything you can and connect the tangents. And that's what Octave Chanute did. He was a true, I think, Renaissance man, especially in transportation.
That's excellent. And I did say that would be the last question, but we had a really good question from Ron, which is, did Chanute leave many papers to study?
Yes, and they're up at University of Wyoming. An awful lot. And you know, I love the title of this, Science and Industry of Kansas City. There was a club, a nonprofit group, the Science and Industry Association of Kansas City, something like that. And he presented a paper on the sewer system of Kansas City and recommended, hey, don't combine them. Don't combine house water and rainwater. You know, make sure you have two separate systems. Yeah, it's going to be more expensive, but take a look at Louisville. They did it two separate ways, and it's a lot cleaner and more. But yeah, he left a lot of papers, and he came back and lived in Kansas City. Not only the time that he was building the bridge here, and for years he was a contract city engineer for the city of Kansas City, Missouri. But all of his papers, I believe it's University of Wyoming, but there's whole boxes that they'll, if you send them money to photocopy them, they'll send them to you, and probably scan them nowadays. When I read his book, The Kansas City Bridge, I had to take 150 dimes to the library and photocopy the page off of microfilm to get my copy of his book. So they probably scan it to me now, and I just write them a check. But I've been at Chanute a while, so it's great to share him with you and your audience.
Well, we appreciate you sharing him with our audience, and just thank you, Bill, for this great presentation.
You bet. Anytime, Will. You find me and I'll try to help you.